Hello, everyone. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you to this online roundtable, part of the Cities of Geneva 2025 campaign against homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. My name is Guillaume Mandicourt. My pronouns are he, him. I'm in charge of LGBTIQ-related public policies at the City of Geneva, Switzerland. For the 12th consecutive year, the City of Geneva is organizing this campaign around Haute, the 2025 edition, under the motto Together Against Cyber Violence Toward LGBTIQ People, focuses on the digital challenges facing LGBTIQ communities. Like never before, online spaces offer vital support, visibility, and freedom of expression for LGBTIQ individuals, especially when their offline environment is unsupportive and hostile. They are necessary places for self-discovery, community building, and human rights advocacy. In many cases, they are the only safe space available. However, as highlighted throughout these 2 weeks of campaign events, the internet is also a site of great violence, harassment, hate speech, algorithmic censorship, stereotype amplification, and increased surveillance, massively enhanced by new technology and artificial intelligence. These cyber violences are very real consequences, not only for those targeted, but for society at large. They silence voices, shrink civic space, and undermine democracy. While 64 countries still criminalize same-sex relations and 7 impose the death penalty, while LGBTIQ people remain at risk simply for being visible or connecting with one another, today's conversation is more necessary than ever. I warmly thank our outstanding panel for sharing their experience and insights with us. Thanks to ILGA Award for this fruitful conversation and the City of Geneva's International Cooperation Department for the indispensable support. Thanks to our interpreters for enabling this exchange in English, French, Spanish, and sign language, and to everyone involved in organizing this event. Our poster campaign, visible across Geneva until Monday, calls on everyone to speak out against online hate with empathy and solidarity. While individual action matters, this fight cannot rest on it alone. It is our shared responsibility to ensure LGBTIQ people's safety online and offline everywhere. Thank you for your attention. I now give the floor to Gulshan Sandhu, ILGA Awards Director of Programs, for his opening remarks. Gulshan.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Gulshan. I also go by Nanu, they, he, and I am the Director of Programs at ILGA World. I want to start off by saying that as LGBTI people, we exist everywhere and we take up space, and it's important for us to take up space, especially in public spaces. However, those spaces are not always safe for us. And so I want to extend my thanks to the great work that the Ville de Genève is doing around increasing awareness around safety in public spaces, and not just in public spaces, but also digital public spaces too. So my thanks for this opportunity to co-host this important dialogue of LGBTI inclusion with the Ville de Genève, and my thanks to Guillaume Mandicourt and his team and M for co-hosting with us, and to the ILGA World team as well. The Ville de Genève's Ida Herbert campaign this year focuses on challenging online violence against our communities, and this campaign is more urgent than ever. Every queer person in this room here today and beyond knows what the internet has been like for them, a source of community and activism, but also of exposure to harassment, threats, or at best, unchecked negativity. Violence and discrimination faced by LGBTI people has poured very easily into online spaces and has intersected with aspects that shape the digital divide, such as uneven and often inadequate telecommunication infrastructure, high cost of devices, and lack of accessible content. Some pieces of data I'd like to share with you. An estimated 2.6 billion people remain offline. And that's 1/3 of the world. But being online is not enough. Are we able to do it Are we able to be in that space meaningfully? in a way that enriches our everyday experiences while being respected for who we are and not being exposed to further threats. To date, 64 UN member states, as Guillaume pointed out, continue to criminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts. While online spaces used for dating or even just to find community, the mere existence of these laws makes online spaces unsafe for our communities. 61 UN member states have provisions that restrict freedom of expression on sexual and gender diversity. That means that being online openly as oneself may be illegal. It means information about your rights and the community around you may be harder to find, pushing you into isolation. During the past years, ILGA World has been working hard to ensure LGBTI people are put on the map when the digital divide is discussed. We spoke with our 2,000 plus members and communities worldwide, launched pioneering global research focused on the stories of activists in every region, and launched a regranting initiative to support digital inclusion of our communities. This is only the start of what really needs to be done to ensure our communities can enjoy online spaces safely and with equal access opportunities. My colleague Daniele Paletta, ILGA World's communication manager, and the person who has led our work on the issue will tell you more about this work that we've done. And together with the great panelists we have lined up for you in today's event. We thank again Ville de Genéve for their support and invaluable solidarity for ILGA World, and for this opportunity to discuss the digital inclusion of LGBTI people everywhere. And please, take this message home with you. Violence is violence, no matter whether in physical or virtual spaces. How we address it must be a part of the broader conversation about inclusion. Thank you. I'd like to now turn to our moderator today. So Hazbi, if you can take us through the introductions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. What a great introduction. Want to say thanks for that, and thanks for the invitation making this panel possible. To everybody in the audience, happy to meet you. I'm Hazbi Avdiji. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. And I'm here because I'm deeply invested in issues of diversity and discrimination, particularly in workplaces and digital spaces, for which I teach at the University of Lausanne and HEG Geneva here in Switzerland. So not only am I happy to talk to moderate this panel because of the topic, but also because of the incredible panelists that we have here. So I'm really, really happy and really looking forward to having a conversation with you. Shreshtha Das from Amnesty International, Rasha Younes from Human Rights Watch, and Daniele Paletta from ILGA World. I'll just say a few words about you. If you want to jump in and add a little bit details about who you are, feel welcome to do so. So Rasha, you're an interim director of the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch, feminist researcher who I think advocates for justice, human rights, and life conditions of LGBT people, which we'll be talking about today. And I think you studied anthropology as well. Is that right?
That is all correct. Thank you.
Perfect. Next one, Daniele, from ILGA World, organization where I've already talked about, communications manager, freelance journalist, writing about culture, and also worked in newsrooms. That's what I learned. A book writer, and something that we talked about, also a former career in the music industry, same thing as I did. Really happy to have you here. Shreshtha goes by the pronouns they, them, queer, disabled activist, working at Amnesty International as a gender advisor researcher, in which she developed the Make It Safe Online for Women, Girls, and LGBTI People project, a project that looks at some of the things that we'll talk about today, which is technology-facilitated gender-based violence through an intersectional and decolonial lens in different country context. I'm really looking forward to this conversation and some topics that influence your professional, career, gender, sexuality, sexual and reproductive health, militarization, sorry, hard word to say, racial justice, and above all, holistic um, and systemic frame of analysis. Happy to have you, the three of you here. We'll be hearing about your work more in detail in the discussion today, in which we're going to talk about violence, as some of you have heard. One thing that I want to say to the attendees is, since we'll be talking about violence, sometimes we'll probably be sharing also stories and experiences of individuals. So some of these topics might be a bit disturbing to hear and talk about. So do whatever feels right to you. If you want to leave the Zoom call, do so. If you want to talk to one of us, do so as well. So really, let's all take care of each other. Another thing that I want to add is that we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for questions from the audience at the end. If you want to write the questions or comments in the chat during the discussion, feel free to do so, and I'll pick them either during the discussion or at the end, depending on how that flows with the conversation. So with that being said, let's start. We have quite some topics to tackle. One thing I want to say is that the work that we'll be discussing today is based on several reports that we will be sharing with all of you today. So reports by ILGA World, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch. And in these reports, one of the central topics is digital space, the digital space, and we'll talk about that quite a lot during this conversation. So I would like to start with a simple yet crucial point for now. Why do we talk about digital spaces for LGBTI populations? Why are these spaces important, especially in the context that you cover? Just to name a few: Uganda, Thailand, Brazil, Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia. So to any of you three who wants to answer that, otherwise I can name who wants to start.
I'm happy. I'm happy to be the sacrificial volunteer. I mean, it's a very good question, and it's something that, we kind of took for granted for a long time, that we would, um, be able to either organize, resistance. For example, in Tunisia, famously, the revolution started on Facebook. And then I remember specifically during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, when I was the senior researcher on the LGBT rights um, landscape in the Middle East and North Africa at large. I started noticing that these spaces have become the only vital space that people can meet, and that they really have become sites of violence because they are the only spaces where people can meet. That is not to say that this started in the pandemic, but the fact that the pandemic demonstrated how important digital landscapes are and these spheres are for people in the absence of any offline realm. In many places where I work, for example, in Algeria, civil society organizations that work on gender and sexuality are prohibited from registering, let alone dabbling. In Tunisia, there has been a crackdown on LGBT rights activism. In Lebanon, there's a ministerial ban that basically bans any event around gender and sexuality without defining, the reason or what constitutes a ban on gender and sexuality. So really emanating to feminist discussions about reproductive health, um, anything that the government deems quote unquote inappropriate, right? So it's that kind of stretch where the digital sphere that once used to be kind of a safe haven that we took for granted as a way to connect, to meet, to date, has now become really a site of violence in a way that legislation is even being introduced in many, many contexts that prohibits primarily this concept of promoting homosexuality, which that is never defined. It's such a vague concept that everything that appears on the internet could be considered as such. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Shreshtha. Daniele, does this resonate with you? Just probably before we'll talk about legislation at some point. This is a topic that we'll cover.
Yeah, just to add to what Rasha was saying, definitely in a lot of contexts, online spaces become the only safe space. For example, in Uganda, after the Anti-Homosexuality Act was passed and physical gatherings were even more endangered than before, online spaces became vital for the community while simultaneously being suppressed. So, in addition, it allows you to create a virtual sense of community, which is so important when you're facing so much clampdown, not just at the national, regional, or local level, but internationally. And we found that was really important for people's sense of well-being and mental health as well, to be able to talk to somebody, to be able to share stories, jokes, even like simple things like that. But of course, there are a lot more serious things that are happening over the internet as well. People are able organizing, as Rasha was saying, but also able to share about what a rights-based framing for LGBTQI people looks like. They're able to build a sense of community, support each other, share really vital information about sexual and reproductive health rights, about document human rights abuses, share what kind of support services are available, warn people in advance if there are any threats to them. And most importantly, it allows for a positive and affirmative visibility for LGBT people and their representation, which they can shape themselves versus the constant disinformation that we see about LGBTI people. So this allows them to take over the narrative and share what they want to share about themselves versus an imposed narrative that's being cast on LGBTI people. So definitely echo what Rasha is saying, but we also seeing that there's a sense of like community building that happens, a lot of advocacy and activism that's happening. And it's really a space where people can provide information and provide support to each other as well.
So, Daniele, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can only echo them, both Rasha and Shreshtha. I think that really resonates for us at the ILGA World. The looking at the digital space really started as part of a broader conversation about access to information, about how accessible for people with disabilities, for example, our communications were. And in time, we really realized that, I mean, we have over 2,000 member organizations around the world. And all the advocacy opportunities that we promote, for example, but even our communications at large all happen online. And when there's one third of the world that doesn't even access the internet, it means that even if we don't want to, we are leaving people out. And so we need to look at how digital inclusion really affects our communities. And doing research on the topic, we really found out that there are specific ways in which the digital divide affects LGBTI people. But if I may add also a more personal note, I do remember also what the internet meant for me um, as a person, as a kid growing up in a very small rural village in northern Italy, when it felt pretty much like I was the only gay person around. And well, the my process of coming out more or less coincided when internet started to get into the households, right? So internet pretty much has been a lifeline for me to connect with other people and find community and find other LGBTI people around me, like even meeting people and just not being the only person anymore. It was a lifeline, so I do remember pretty well, even if it was 2000 centuries ago, uh, what it meant, and I'm pretty sure that means that many other people still go through the same experience.
Thanks a lot. I personally did, so really resonate with that. You just mentioned the digital divide. Like like to spend a bit more time on this. So for the audience, please feel free to provide another definition. But to say things in a very simple way, for those of you who have never heard of the term, the digital divide is basically the difference in how, for some people, it is easy to have access to technology and to use them, and to some not. So there's divide between those who can and those who cannot. And Daniele, I know that at ILGA World you did through this report like an extensive research on the digital divides in plural, I would say. So can you tell us more about those that you have identified and what they are due to?
Absolutely. So yeah, you've already heard a lot this number, 2.6 billion people remaining offline. Again, 1/3 of the world. The missing pieces of data here is that according to the International Telecommunications Union, the 97% of the world lives in areas with at least some minimal kind of internet coverage. So we immediately see that there's a very wide gap between who could and who does access the internet. So it really needs to be looked into. And generally in the public conversation, when we speak about the digital divide, it's often understood as something that has to deal with technology, with a lack of connectivity, with poor internet connection. And the more I started to dig into the topic, the broader it actually looked, because it's a matter of access and cost. It's about the quality of service and how inclusive and accessible the design is of the platforms and all the interfaces that we use. It's about being safe online. So it's the digital literacy, it's the digital security, and whether do we even have access to the very basic software to protect our privacy and our online presence. And especially for LGBTI people, there are issues of legal and policy barriers that actually push our communities out. So I don't want to preempt the many conversations that we're going to have later, but the digital divide has been studied very much across different perspectives. For example, the gender digital divide. At the moment, 70% of men use the internet compared to 65% of women, which means that on the internet there are 189 million men more than women. Usually these statistics are very binary. They do not include gender non-conforming and non-binary people, which is one of the limit of these numbers. But that already tells you that there are very specific differences in digital access. Another perspective that's always looked at is the urban versus rural divide, the socioeconomic status of the people accessing, the disability status of the person who is trying to be online. So there are many, many different aspects. Until we looked into the topic, there was very minimal study at the global level of the digital divide and LGBTI people. But especially because the topic is so broad and it intersects with so many aspects of a person's identity, we immediately realized that we couldn't have possibly covered everything. So the way that we actually approached the topic was to tell stories of people in each region. And by doing these stories, we were able to cover the various intersections of identities. For example, when we talked about Europe and Central Asia, we addressed the digital divide through the experience of a sex workers community. When we spoke to somebody in Oceania, we talked to activists in Tonga who were sharing the very practical limitations it has to have to deal with a weak digital infrastructure. Like I have to go do HIV/AIDS awareness training in a remote island. Do I get internet connection there? Because if not, I have to print leaflets. But if I have to print leaflets, I can bring fewer clothes with me. So like, and it really gets to very, very practical examples of how the lack of connectivity impacts the work of activists. So yeah, I'm gonna stop here, but I'm sure there's much more that we can talk about later.
Thanks a lot for this beautiful landscape of all the causes behind the digital divide. I'd like to take some time here to focus on one thing that you mentioned. At some point, you mentioned danger, security. And one thing that all of your reports have in common, and all of the work that you do have in common, is this notion of violence, and especially violence made possible by digital technologies. So a question to any of you three, probably starting with you, Shreshtha. What is specific about violence through technology compared to, I don't know, if I can use this term, like strictly offline or in-person violence?
So I want to start by saying that what happens in online spaces exists on a continuum, right? At the base of it all is an asymmetry of power. It's a gender hierarchy, and it's norms and stereotypes that are replicated and amplified online. So at the basis of it is gender inequality that we see in offline spaces that then gets reproduced and amplified in online spaces as well. So there is that sort of a continuum that we see. But at the same time, there is a bit of difference as well in terms of how TFGBB is perpetuated. So there is that, like I said, the same harmful gender stereotypes and norms and various forms of discrimination that we see in offline spaces are amplified and reproduced. But there are some unique forms of TFGBV as well. And this happens because of the unique characteristics of the digital space, right? So, for example, it affords a lot of anonymity to people. Sometimes there are bots, people are hiding behind fake accounts, and it doesn't like you don't exactly always know the person you're targeting. So it allows significant amount of anonymity. And you can target somebody even without any proximity to the person who is being targeted. It can also then mean that there's cross-jurisdictional targeting as well. So the perpetrator can be in a different jurisdiction and the survivor can be in a different jurisdiction, which also then makes prosecution that much more difficult. And I think the most important thing which differs in the online space is really how easily any form of gender-based violence can be amplified. So whether it's deep fakes, whether it's online harassment, smear campaigns, it spreads like wildfire and it's difficult to control once it's been put out there. And then it also means that it exists in perpetuity. People can download the information, people can screenshot it. So it really makes it that much more difficult to control. And of course, now with deepfakes and AI, we are experiencing a whole new level of what is possible and what is not possible, especially in terms of creating gender disinformation or maligning and trying to shame people using very gendered stereotypes. We don't know what is actually the truth, and this kind of disinformation can easily spread and cause real hardships to people.
So we see new forms and probably also new scales of violence, as you just said. Some of you that you mentioned, like hateful speech, threats of violence. Some of your reports also mentioned that LGBTI populations, in the context that you've analyzed, also face digital surveillance. But I'd like to focus on two forms of violence that probably we hear a bit less of. And I'd like to hear you, Rasha, about the Human Rights Watch report about digital violence against LGBTI populations in Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, if I remember right. And there's a lot of stories of people being entrapped. And could you probably maybe explain what entrapment is and how it's set up?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question, and I do agree with everything. I've just been nodding profusely to everything other panelists have been saying. When the reason we decided to do a regional scope of a report on digital targeting is because of these parallel methods of prosecution and persecution that demonstrate how this is, as you were saying, just across borders, right? This is not it's not a practice where there's any form of accountability. And it's important to note that abusive governments, and specifically governments that have laws criminalizing same-sex conduct, use the online platforms in very similar ways to target and hunt down and prosecute LGBT people. So specifically on entrapment, the notorious example is Egypt, and Egypt has been doing this since the 90s. before even, we had any kind of social media platforms even existing. So in the sense that police officers or security official or anyone who is the perpetrator of violence would um, basically reach out to unsuspecting queer or trans people, whether it be on dating apps like Grindr or Facebook, Twitter, anywhere else, and send a message saying basically I'm pretending to be also a queer or trans person themselves and suggesting a meeting. And after that, when the meeting does happen, it would be an ambush. So the police officers would then, or if one or many others in Iraq, it was also gang violence and on groups. It wasn't just security officials would then arrest, abduct, or abuse the person who has been entrapped. This happens purely online, and by doing this, the most important element of prosecution under these kinds of tactics is the digital quote unquote evidence that is collected in the process. So, for example, even merely having a profile on Grindr or having the app on the phone of the person who had then been arrested has been enough in our documentation to prosecute them for quote unquote inciting debauchery in Egypt, for example. So it's that type of, I put evidence in quotes because obviously this is just digital information. It's not evidence and it should not be admissible in any court of law. But that's what has been increasingly relied on by these governments and police and prosecutors to be able to justify the prosecution of LGBT people. So if a person who's the perpetrator of entrapment would say, for example, the first question they would ask someone, how much do you charge in exchange for sex? And that if there's any kind of interaction or response on that is in writing, then that would be enough for the police officer to prosecute this individual under quote unquote anti-prostitution laws, right? So it's that kind of tactics that even absent laws that explicitly criminalize sexual conduct would become the de facto kind of basis for prosecution.
Before I move on to another form of violence, just want to, since we're on the topic of legislation, remember there was the sentence in the report, the Human Rights Watch report, which I found like could really set the stage about the anti-LGBT laws that you mentioned, and I will read it. So, quote unquote, while digital advocacy has contributed to reversing injustices against LGBT individuals, governments have also used digital methods to monitor and target LGBT people, and they have a critical advantage on their side, anti-LGBT laws. You started mentioning a few things about these laws, so probably not without like don't need to go into the details of each law, but if you can tell us about how they are used, and sometimes also I had the feeling that it even helped set up an apparatus, a state apparatus somehow. So if you'd like to share about that.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to emphasize that the precarity of LGBT people offline is enabled by their legal online, sorry, is enabled by their legal precarity offline. If there aren't laws that would criminalize expression even around gender and sexuality or quote unquote even identities when it comes to transgender individuals or these, quote unquote morality laws, we wouldn't then be witnessing the same amount of justification for hatred and hate speech and online violence that we already are. Because when a person is breaking the law offline, whether it be through a same-sex act or relationship or however the law defines it, it requires that an act occurs. It requires that they're either seen conducting the act or someone has said something about them. Online, it shows even the expression of identity around LGBT issues, absent any act that would actually criminalize under the legislation itself. So authorities start using things that have nothing to do with the law itself where same-sex conduct is criminalized, use things like, you know, cybercrime legislation, quote unquote morality laws, anti-prostitution laws, debauchery laws, interfering with the state laws, foreign agent laws. It's just the list is endless on the kind of legislation that could be weaponized against people for practicing any kind of peaceful expression around gender and sexuality, which of course risks completely erasing these topics from public discourse. And of course, online spaces are form of public discourse.
So we see here that we're starting to see the many layers of how this violence is operating. Shreshtha, you mentioned before the patriarchal or sexist, I would say, dynamics at play anyway in societies. Legislation here and technology on top. We'll add some more right after. Before that, just want to spend a little bit more time also on doxing, another form of violence that is not specific to LGBTI populations, but with the notion of outing, it really becomes somehow specific to us. So I think both of your research, Shreshtha and Rasha, mentioned that. Can I ask you to define for the audience what doxing is? And how that impacts the lives of LGBTI individuals.
Yeah, so doxing basically involves revealing, identifying information about a person, whether their name, their photo, their address, names of family members, where they work, ID cards, often with a malicious intent and obviously without any consent. Adding to what Rasha is saying, obviously in context where there's criminalization, all of this become even more threatening. For example, when such kind of identifying information is revealed in the case of Uganda, for instance, we saw that it led to large amount of outing. And in a context where there is heavy bias, violence, and discrimination against LGBTI people, this has very severe consequences. In some cases, we've seen not just threats of violence, but actual physical violence against people once personal information about them, including their name, where they live, that kind of information was revealed. In some instances, the outing has resulted in them being ousted from their family homes. In one instance, we documented that a director of SRHR organization whose work was revealed, not that they themselves are a part of queer community, were evicted by their landlord as well. So there are very many serious consequences about people's information being revealed. But one thing I would add is that it's obviously in context where there's heavy criminalization, doxing has certain repercussions, but doxing is happening across the world and not just in context where there's criminalization. Whether it's Canada, South Africa, India, these are all spaces where LGBTI people are quote unquote not criminalized. But I think going back to this patriarchal norms, mindsets about LGBTI people, transphobia, homophobia, they exist with or without discrimination, with or without criminalization, right? So I would like to say that, and again, intersectionality here becomes important. For instance, in Canada, we've seen it's predominantly trans people who get dogs, like their real names, their addresses are shared, which means they're threatened with physical violence. There are rape threats, death threats, and that really puts people at risk of bodily harm and lack of bodily autonomy. Obviously, it's a violation, direct violation of right to privacy, but there are serious consequences for bodily autonomy as well. People have had to leave workplaces once they've been doxxed. So just to say that, reiterate that people online often think that online violence remains in online spaces, but to say that, of course, it has like mental health impacts, but really it has such severe impacts when things like doxing and outing happen to people across all contexts and not just in context of severe criminalization.
Thank you. I do want to add, you said all of I just want to add specific examples that we've documented of how egregious this could get, right? You know, in the context of Iraq, for example, Iraq in April 2024 is passed legislation that criminalizes same-sex conduct for the first time ever. Our report was published before then. The report documented 45 cases of arbitrary arrest and prosecutions and dozens of cases of abduction, sexual violence. Sorry, this is also a trigger warning for everyone. killings as well in the context of specifically in Iran. What this means in relation to doxing is that even the threat of outing is enough to upend a person's entire life. For example, there's one individual who spoke to us about how an armed group who they do announce who they are usually in the messages that they send. Basically threatened to out him. This is in Baghdad. Threatened to out him to everyone, to his family even, primarily because family violence we also know is a huge factor, and family rejection of course becomes kind of a societal consequence. So even that threat to outing, this person not only faced harassment online, but was extorted for 30,000 US dollars from this armed group in exchange for just not being outed. So even the threat of outing really could just be a disaster for people. But in another instance where the outing was happening, for example, in Tunisia around the protests that were taking place in 2021 and 2022, LGBT rights activists, of course, were at the forefront of, as we always are, of these demonstrations. And police officers that are actually in Tunisia unionized in these, very malicious unions that target activists would take their picture in the protest, post it on Facebook, mention their private information and just derogatory comments about their appearance, and just let that take a life of its own. They wouldn't even need to resort to prosecution because the consequences of this information becoming online has led to attempted suicide by activists that we have spoken to in Tunisia, has led to prosecution and complete relocation from the country. People sought asylum outside of Tunisia because of this just one act. So just to emphasize that the instance of online violence does not end there. It reverberates throughout individuals' lives in ways that we have documented literally ruin their lives.
And it goes back to, I don't know who mentioned it today, to this online offline continuum, the fact that what you just said, basically, that online violence has consequences in the offline world. We've mentioned relocation, we've mentioned suicide, just trying to make a list of all the consequences that violence through technology can have. There's also an important point, mental health. I think it was mentioned in some of your reports. I don't know if you'd like to share a few words about that, and also how mental health issues are dealt or not dealt with, depending on the context and the situations of the people.
I'm happy to jump in on that one, Hazbi, unless Daniel, Rasha, would you like to go ahead?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of mental health, we've seen like severe repercussions in especially like isolation. As we said in the beginning, LGBT digital spaces are really important spaces for community building. For example, in Uganda, we saw that because of the surveillance that happens in online spaces, people were forced to unfollow accounts that are seen as providing LGBTI content, unfollow people who are vocally speaking out on LGBTI issues, unfollow pages, etc., which means they're really feeling isolated. And this really impacted mental health. People spoke about depression, anxiety, things like doxing, outing, the fact that their data, their devices, their data, etc., can be taken anytime, entrapment, which Rasha mentioned. There's also a lot of online blackmailing. All of this has had severe consequences. People speak about suicidal ideation as well. And it's funny that suicidal ideation actually has criminal consequences in a lot of contexts, but there is no law to criminalize TFGBV. Like, it's not funny, but it's really ironic in that sense, that people are being pushed to the edge, but there is nothing to actually do anything against the perpetration of violence. But I also wanted to add that in addition, there is also social ostracization. So once you are doxxed or you are outed, your social circles can also shrink massively because people become scared to be associated with you. And we've seen this in various contexts as well, that when governments end up targeting or there is doxing on social media platforms of one person, their social networks, or even if there is a threat of For example, when Pegasus attacks happened and the list of people who were being targeted through Pegasus was revealed, it also makes people way more anxious of associating with certain people who are under surveillance or who are outspoken as well, which can really restrict their social networks and communities as well. And the other thing I would say in terms of consequences and impact is also like sexual and reproductive health impact. So it's not just mental health, but digital spaces are really important for circulating information about sexual and reproductive health, for example. And in Uganda, especially, we saw that people were saying if earlier they could just put out a social media post, they were able to reach 1,500 people, but now they can reach 150 people because they're so careful about who they can reach. It has to be through direct communication as well. So there is a significant impact on sexual and reproductive health outreach as well. And so while we see that people are left with these kind of debilitating impact on their sexual and reproductive health and mental health, at the same time, the services that you would offer to people, whether sexual and reproductive health services or mental health support services, the outreach is also significantly shrinking because there is so much fear about who is in these platforms, who you can reach. So many people are forced to unfollow you. So simultaneously, people are facing these extreme situations, but also can't access support because digital spaces are shrinking so much. And I guess the last thing that I will add before I hand over to Rasha and Danielle is also the economic impact. A lot of queer people are also engaged in sex work as well. So some of the things that they said is that putting our information or seeking clients in these spaces becomes even more difficult. Digital platforms have become quite a common space of finding clients, etc. And that's taken a hit. And again, when there is doxing outing as well, people have said that they've lost their jobs and put their source of livelihood at serious risk as well. Yeah, I'll stop at that.
Daniele, you want to add something?
Yeah, on what the online violence does to people in terms of their mental health. There are a couple of concepts that really stayed with me during the research that we did. One is a concept again from activists in Uganda that a researcher collected who spoke specifically of controlled visibility. So activists needing to constantly negotiate their relationship between anonymity and visibility. So in other words, what Shreshtha was saying. And this is specifically to activism, but more broadly to LGBTI people. There's a quote of a person from India that we interviewed that said, "We don't have the freedom to loiter, mindlessly scroll, or post about something of their own lives on social media. When it comes to sexuality, you literally don't have the freedom to be mindlessly you and post something online." Which is really impressive because, yeah, that's something that we use the internet for, right? Also to speak freely about ourselves, and that's a privilege that not everybody has. So one is this constant need to have control on what you say and what you do online. That's really affecting people, of course. But I would also add, and that connects back to the violence, the feeling of impunity that people may risk. Because especially when there are criminalizing provisions, even go to police to report having been a victim of online violence, you don't only you're not only met with the disbelief that online violence is not really violence because you can just turn off your laptop or your phone, and we know that's really not the case, but it can also be taken as a proof of a possible quote unquote crime because, well, this person has posted this information about you. Is it true? Are you queer? Are you a criminal? Because under our provisions, you are a criminal. Uh, and I think that's really common also. That there are similarities to gender-based violence and what women face when it comes to finding seeking justice and going to the police and report a crime that they've been faced. Like the feeling of will I be believed? I think it's that there are similarities here.
And related to that, I think Rasha, I think the Human Rights Watch report mentioned, I think it was judicial or legal precarity as one of the central concepts of basically not having a due process, a legal process that you can protect yourself with. Actually, quite the contrary, as Daniele has just said. And this belief is only one dimension of those. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, go into that direction. Or not, but I'd like to hear you a bit more about, yeah, this precarity, this legal judicial precarity that LGBTI
Yeah,
populations face in some contexts.
absolutely. So I'm gonna walk you through a story of a person that I interviewed because I think his story really illustrates, the consequences that we face, especially also the long-term mental health consequences and that on others. So this individual is from Jordan. Um, he's a gay man who was chatting with someone on a dating app, and then they turned on the camera and they were just talking to each other and um, just having a chat, right? This person who was pretending to be, like a date was recording the entire thing. Took it to the police station. Mind you, in Jordan, same-sex conduct is not criminalized. There is no law that criminalizes same-sex conduct, but there's a law that very recently also was even made more intense in cybercrime penalties, right? So cybercrime law that is disastrous for everyone, but specifically for LGBT people, in that it criminalizes anything that is deemed by the authorities to be quote unquote immoral, which opens interpretation for anything. So this person um, basically took the video to and was blackmailing the gay man, and then basically the man was just went to the police station to complain because he said, no, this person is harassing me and threatening me, so I'm going to go to the police. Why wouldn't I? I mean, this is how they're supposed to protect me. Um, so instead of actually holding accountable the perpetrator who was blackmailing this person with this video, this gay man was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. The victim under the cybercrime law for quote unquote promoting prostitution online. What happened after is that he did have to, he was charged and convicted, so he did have to actually spend 6 months in prison for going to the authorities to seek protection. What happened after is that he did say, and this is specifically a section about the long-term consequences of such harassment. So he said, I was very scared and anxious for many years to come. I avoided the police, any state agent, and would think twice about going to any public space. I did not enjoy anything. I stopped talking to my activist friends. Our organization network broke off and vanished. So it's not just the consequence on the individual themselves, but the consequence on in many contexts, the only spaces that exist in resistance that are this organized resistance begin breaking down when there's this kind of fear and intimidation that others could be targeted as well. And the authorities do this on purpose, especially in places like Jordan, where intimidation is enough to render obsolete activism networks. And that's why it has such a chilling effect.
Um, Before, probably, I would like to talk about what we in the Global North can do. I see that there's a question in the chat that I can pick now. I don't know if you have any information about what the persecution level is in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know if any of you have any information about that. It's a question by Kashindi.
I can answer that in 1 minute, but I won't keep everyone waiting. So just let me get the exact language.
So I'll seize the opportunity to talk about the chilling effect that you just mentioned. And Shreshtha, I think this was like a one key aspect, I think in Thailand, especially if I remember right, don't know if you want to share a bit about that, and yeah, explain how this fear or this anticipation of repercussions is actually leading to things like censorship.
Yeah, I'll speak a bit about both Thailand and Uganda and just show the various ways in which chilling effect is happening. So in Thailand, for example, we documented a lot about the use of Pegasus, which means if people are worried that there's spyware on their phone, what they can and cannot say becomes really limited. Which is self-censorship. It also limits who you're talking to, who you're not talking to, because then you become worried about who else you're expanding the government's possible nets of who they see as they need to target through spyware as well. So there is one of that. There is definitely that. We also, in Thailand, we looked at the southern border provinces as well, where we specifically documented the TFGV that Malay Muslim LGBT activists are facing. And there was a lot of like community-based violence that they were facing in addition to the kind of threats that they faced from the state as well. So self-censorship is happening in terms of what people can and cannot say online. And I know we've spoken a lot about laws that directly criminalize people based on their Sogi Sek identities. But it's important, again, in the context of Thailand, to realize that there is intersection. As Rasha was saying, LGBTI people are always at the forefront of, often at the forefront of protests, which is not just related to advancing the rights of LGBTI people, but a range of issues. And so, for example, in Thailand, what we saw that there was an intersection in terms of how LGBTI activists were targeted, because many of them were engaged in criticizing the government and criticizing the monarchy. So the targeting was based not just on being LGBTI themselves, but obviously their queer identities was used in the way that they were targeted, but it was based on criticizing the government. So the self-censorship also happens in terms of how much you feel like you can criticize the government as well. In the context of Uganda, of course, there was so much self-censorship in terms of what people cannot post, not just in terms of not just in terms of language of the post, but also in terms of visuals, audio-visual material, etc. But what we saw was that the chilling effect also spread to organizations that were providing sexual and reproductive rights information. So they had to really reduce the content of what they were posting. They were really worried about the devices being taken, so how they kind of stored data. For example, somebody told us that they could no longer put the name of the person who was seeking, for example, condoms or lubricants from them, but they had to find like code names, which then becomes difficult because if you're trying to go back to the same person, you have to kind of remember what code names have you used. And if you're having like 50 people who you're providing sexual and reproductive health services to, that becomes that much more difficult. So the chilling effect was also in terms of the organizations that were providing sexual and reproductive health services as well. And I would say the chilling effect is important, not just in terms of what it's doing to individuals, but societal level conversations as well. When LGBTI people are retreating from digital spaces, and there's simultaneous disinformation and misinformation being spread about queer people, it also limits how much you can counter this information, how much you can counter these harmful narratives and stereotypes, which makes it that much more dangerous that the people who can, I mean, everybody should be countering this information, but people who are directly impacted are no longer able to counter the kind of disinformation and misinformation that's spreading in online spaces simply because of chilling effect. And the last thing I would say in the context of specifically that we documented in Uganda, for example, after the Anti-Homosexuality Act was passed, if earlier people were using LGBTI or queer, that was a language that could no longer be used. People started using key population language. I'm sure most of us here are aware that the key population language comes from AIDS and HIV prevention language, and it's not necessarily the rights-based language at all, or something that the queer community wants to use for themselves. So it takes us back in terms of the rights-based language that people can and cannot use to refer to themselves, instead forcing into medicalized identities, medicalization of queer identities. And so it's not just that, but one other thing that we've seen is for trans and non-binary people, gender expression was also getting the chilling effect also extended to gender expression. So for example, somebody told us that dreadlocks as a trans man was associated with being queer. So people stopped having dreadlocks, or they were targeted for having dreadlocks. There was a trans woman who used to put out a lot of her videos of her dancing in like traditional clothes and hip shaking, etc. And she had to stop doing that because she said that was something that she could no longer feel safe doing because she was getting death threats on her posts as well. So there's chilling effects happening in multiple ways: how people self-censor, how organizations self-censor, how people self-censor the gender expression as well in online spaces. And all of this is creating or allowing the perpetuation of really harmful stereotypes and narratives about LGBTI people in online spaces.
And I'll extend this with a question that was asked by Natasha in the audience to the three of you. So you've mentioned some points just now, but does this chilling effect pose a threat to democracy? On top of the disinformation that you mentioned, the criticizing the government, the self-censorship, and the challenges that it creates for civil society organizations, are there other things, other consequences that you can share with us?
I'm happy to. Oh, sorry, please go ahead, Shreshtha.
Rasha, go ahead. I can come in after. Yeah, it kind of ties into the point that I was making about like structural marginalization, right? If an entire group of people are silenced based on who they are, um, that means that entire conversation is no longer happening in public spaces. And any form of, whether it's democracy or other forms of public making, are based on the fact that people have access to a variety of information. People have the ability to make informed choices and informed decision making. And when an entire group of people are silenced through various laws, whether it's laws around morality, around hate speech, or what is considered as distorted information. For example, in Thailand, any criticism of monarchy is seen as distorted information. So false information, etc. An entire group of people and their lived realities, when they're silenced, how can it not impact the quality of everybody's lives? Because I would say that we are all interconnected. Our struggles are interconnected. And in that sense, yeah, so people are simultaneously silenced, but can also not put forth their own narratives, which seriously impacts the quality of information based on which we can make informed choices at all.
Please, Daniele, go ahead.
I'll just be very, very brief, but there's also a question about disinformation and misinformations and the narratives in which LGBTI people are presented. Because often, like, authoritarian governments are presenting our communities as threats to the family, threats to stability. We're often presented as a Western import, especially in global majority countries. So when our existence is actually framed as a threat to the stability of a country, well, we immediately are portrayed as enemy of the state. So that puts us in danger, and that puts democracy in danger. And it's also, when it comes to civil society, it's also a matter of what we can and cannot do, and cannot say, actually, sorry. Because it becomes a matter of, if I speak too much, if I'm too explicit, if I'm criticizing the government too much, or if I am being too bold in bringing forward the demands of our communities, is it going to affect the fundings that I'm going to receive? There was an organization from India that we interviewed in our research that was explicitly mentioning this. So even what you can or cannot say can have an impact on funding for your own organization, which, especially in the current climate since January this year, it can really mean whether I can continue or not to do my work as an organization. So yeah, all, this is a very severe threat to democracy. It's definitely not just about LGBTI people.
Nasha, you wanted to add something? Or probably talking about the DRC?
Both, I can do both, but I also conscious of time. So tell me what works. Of course, the fellow panelists answer the question. Very,
Sorry, if you can repeat, I just didn't hear.
Okay, no, let me just go ahead. Okay, so
Yeah.
just on the DRC, so the DRC does not have a law. that criminalizes explicitly same-sex conduct. But the Penal Code under Article 176 does criminalize quote-unquote public indecency, which has been used to target LGBT people and same-sex conduct. There have been attempts more recently in also 2024 to pass criminalization that explicitly criminalizes same-sex relations, but those have not been successful. Does that answer the question?
I hope it does. Who asked the question? Don't remember.
Okay. Just on the specifically on the authoritarianism, because this has been, as the director of the program of the LGBTIQ program, this is something that we're dealing with on a daily basis, with all the types of legislation just being springing up everywhere. And it's this concept of the weaponization of such in many cases, and I will give the example of the Trump administration in the United States, less than 1% of the population to win electoral campaigns, to embolden a largely uninformed public about an issue that they just don't know enough about, and just embolden specifically transphobia that guides the administration's policies and campaigns, to justify passing laws that quote unquote protect children and women when they are in fact jeopardizing women and children and everyone else that they're claiming to protect. And specifically in terms of justifying legislation that would then either ban access to essential healthcare, like for example for transgender youth in the United States who face bans in 27 states to access any kind of gender affirming care, which could mean hormones or puberty blockers, but could even mean just asking their school teachers to call them by their preferred pronouns. So it's that kind of weaponization and scapegoating of such a small minority. And we see this, of course, with refugees and migrants all the time. We've seen it in Europe to justify border regulations, funding, even army, army and military capacities, and just developing all sorts of weapons, starting wars, literally because of migration. And we're seeing now LGBT issues, specifically trans people, becoming the wedge issue that every authoritarian government we're seeing everywhere is leading with to justify larger injustices and larger economic and political decisions that basically undermine the rights of every citizen and resident, but just using that political talking point because it is convincing for people who, again, because of the lack of digital discourse and any public discourse, just have no idea about what trans people and their rights mean, and have never met a trans person and really do think that the fear mongering is there to prevent.
Yeah, the ripple effect in some kind, and circling back to what you all said at the very beginning, that information is a key benefit of digital spaces. I'm wondering is there anything that the big tech can do, that all these digital platforms can do? You all had a lot of recommendations to governments, to NGOs, but I would like to hear you on what our dear digital platforms can do to improve the digital safety of LGBTI populations.
Sorry, I unmuted myself because I have a lot of feelings about this. Okay. So when we did the report, we did also make recommendations to companies such as Meta primarily, with whom we've been trying to do advocacy privately for a long time, and who just never responds to any of our letters in writing, and everything they say is off the record. So then we published a campaign called Secure Our Socials, which was published in 2024, specifically targeting Meta to make changes to its content moderation policies. And I'll explain what I mean. But companies have a responsibility and an obligation to mitigate the harms that their services, wherever they occur across the globe, have in terms of human rights. This is under the UN guiding principles on the human rights. So this is not just because, well, they would like to, or because they're an ally. It's their obligation to do so. And they've been really, really falling short. In many regards, it is the tech platform that, absent protections and policies, allows for bad actors to either penetrate or target queer and trans people. There's a lot that they can do in Arabic, specifically for the Middle East and North Africa region. We have no visibility about transparency from companies like Meta on how many people they have humans who moderate content that appears on their platform in the Arabic language. Of course, the Arabic language has dozens of dialects, so this is not something where one Moroccan, language speaker can even Moroccan language itself has multiple dialects. Can vet or see harmful content and understand the meanings and be able to remove it from platforms before it has the offline consequences that we documented. Also, because Meta, for example, just relies on automation so many times. We've seen this also in the context of censorship related to Palestine. If there's a rainbow flag somewhere, if there is, any kind of ism, sure, that it is either kept online or deleted. But there are so many nuances with hate speech and with these kinds of um, um, with this kind of like misinformation and conduct that perpetrators have, especially governments, that automation cannot capture. We also have no idea how automation works in around the world because Meta does not publish any of this information. There's no transparency about any of the staffing, any of the regularity of how many mistakes the company makes, how it addresses its mistakes. When we talk about due process, we're not just talking about due process for governments, we're also talking about due process for companies that should be able to publish their error rates, and work with civil society to rectify a lot of the policies or the absence of policies that allows for these kinds of abuses to proliferate and ruin people's lives.
I can also add a bit. Sorry, Danny, did you want to go? So also to say that when we published the Uganda report, which was last year, in a context of extreme criminalization, we had a lot of expectations from digital platforms and hoping that some change could happen. However, since January 2025 and the advent of oligarchy, where social media companies, which were already doing bad, as Rasha has highlighted, have gone worse. They have fired whole human rights departments. They have said they will not do content moderation. In fact, transphobia is actively encouraged, homophobia and transphobia, including by their founders. So at this juncture, I find myself quite skeptical of what we can actually expect social media platforms to be doing and not be doing. However, I do want to reinforce what Rasha was saying. Sorry, I have a furry friend who is going to make an intervention very soon, but till then, let me say. So they are obligated by business and human rights standard to be doing due diligence of how their platforms affect different groups and populations, including those facing specific marginalization, including women and LGBTI people. In addition to lack of transparency around content moderation, there is no equitability in how language besides English is moderated and how many content moderators they have, which is not automated. The other thing we've noticed across different contexts is people are not aware, or there hasn't enough been done by social media companies to make people aware of how they can file a report. There is no transparency in terms of the procedure that will be followed. So you can file a report, but you may never hear back about it, which we've seen in very, very many contexts as well. So people are not aware, people do not receive feedback on a complaint that they have filed. So there aren't transparent, accessible systems. People are not very aware of these systems, but also about algorithmic amplification. So for example, TikTok has this For You feed, right? And we don't, and the frameworks through which algorithmic amplification is done, or through which social media platforms amplify their content, that needs to be made more transparent so that independent researchers can look at what the framework is, what the data set is, and suggest to these digital platforms about how they can reduce the amplification of anti-LGBTI content as well.
Yeah, I just want to add, just as Rasha, I feel very strongly about the topic, so I share completely what all the things you said, and And also to echo Shreshtha, the issue of language is so important because, and again, it goes back to the digital divide issue. That's another component. Again, I'm gonna give you a couple of pieces of data, but we have about 6,000 languages in the world, more or less. 10 of these 6,000 make up the 82% of the internet. English is spoken only by 16% of the world speakers. 55% of all online content is in English. And English is also the leading language of coding, by the way. So there's an absolute disparity in language. And what that means when content moderation is all automated is that the vast majority of language is not moderated or not moderated effectively. And when there's a risk of online violence going into the offline world, even if there's an intervention, it may be way too late. But the issue goes also the other way, meaning that we know of lots of people posting LGBTI content online and being censored as slur or going against policy guidelines where it was simply an issue of self-expression. Maybe just because the moderators, the automated moderator, did not recognize what the actual issue was, right? So the language issue is really big. And just to add, a couple of days ago, GLAAD in the US published a report, the Social Media Safety Index, analyzing the 6 major social media platforms in the West. They write that all companies are failing to meet basic standards across most safety metrics. And especially in 2025, there have been appalling rollbacks when it comes to hate speech policy. YouTube has removed gender identity as a protected ground against hate speech. Meta has allowed new exceptions, and again, trigger warning, but that's the policy of the main platforms that we spend the whole days on. They now allow to say that LGBTQ people are abnormal or mentally ill, or they also allow to say that women should belong to the household. And while this is appalling and we continue to be shocked, we also have to note that things have gone much worse because only a few years ago, these companies were actually engaging with us. At ILGA World, we met with several of these platforms to help them in their hate speech policies. I was there. I was at these meetings. Now it's even difficult to have a contact point. And I cannot explain why, to be honest. I
Can
do
I
not
explain why?
know what has changed. I mean, I have my suspects, but
I mean, just and for Mark Zuckerberg and Trump, and also Elon Musk and Trump, and just to take that example, right? So I don't want to get into the US context because it's such a headache and really absurd, but the Doge department that Elon Musk now has, Elon Musk is the owner of Twitter, right? So Twitter also has just completely dismissed all human rights related anything from the platform. Mark Zuckerberg, who hadn't allied with the first Trump administration as strongly, in January, and you were saying January 2025, which is the same time that Trump got inaugurated, Mark Zuckerberg made an appearance basically saying anything that is part of quote unquote mainstream discourse, which is not defined by the company, is allowed on the platform. So that's what allowed for changes in policies where hate speech policy is now called quote unquote hateful conduct, which is also not defined. And basically so many of the protections that we were already advocating to improve are now being eroded even further. There's this very, very close relationship between authoritarianism and technology, and technology facilitated authoritarianism specifically. The reason why we're seeing this kind of rapid pace of this abusive legislation and this rise of authoritarianism and right-wing governments everywhere is because technology has allowed for that kind of pace of coordination for these groups as well, as much as it has allowed for us as activists and advocates to coordinate. But the difference is they now have the funding. Instead of, funding DEI, the Trump administration is funding family values groups in Africa. So it's just that kind of technology enabling authoritarianism on the larger scale that precipitates towards literally making every platform a hostile context for many people.
And if I may add, the impact on LGBTI grassroots organization is even more confusing because so many of them and so many of us would actually like to leave these platforms altogether because they are failing us so much. And many of our member organizations that we speak to, they say, well, actually, no, we cannot leave because that's the only avenue that we have to convey information to our communities. And some of them are saying to us, well, you shouldn't leave either, not even X, for example, because if you leave that platform, then we leave it entirely uh, to the people who are coming for us every day. So it's a very difficult decision for them to make. And again, it goes back to privilege. Many organizations in our movements do not have the privilege to decide to leave.
Totally, and yeah, as you said, there like big tech is failing us somehow. And I think I would like to focus for the end of this panel discussion on two initiatives. If anybody in the audience has one last question, I can take it, just drop it in the chat. In the meantime, while you think of that question, I'd like to talk about the micro grants that you are putting in place at ILGA World, Daniele, which are funding initiatives that are working in some way or another for greater digital inclusion for LGBTI populations. Floor is yours if you want to tell us more about it.
Sure. This is an initiative that we launched at the end of last year after our research came out, and we really built on the findings of that research to actually try and bring material support to grassroots communities. So we launched this call for projects that we could support about digital inclusion and leaving the concept of digital inclusion like willingly very, very broadly. The grants were not very rich in the sense that we could only offer like 11 grants by a few thousand francs each. But myself and my colleague Swell Anglin, who's here doing the tech moderation today, and I thank her as well as my other colleague Oscar, who's also doing the same. But the two of us were actually in the evaluating panel of all the proposals that we were receiving. And even if we were explicit that we were only able to finance 10 projects, we received 450 proposals. And all of them were incredibly valid. Like choosing the 10 grantees was really impossible. And in the end, we went to cover as many aspects of intersectionality once again that we could. And we were trying also to cover different regions of the world. But I'm only gonna mention a few of the projects that we supported just to give you the breadth of the scope, right? We were able to support a queer media outlet to improve the accessibility of the website for people with disabilities. We provided support to a group that developed manuals that were addressing gender disinformation and digital hygiene. And then this group went to organize 5 meetings with grassroots communities in rural areas to actually disseminate this content. We supported the translation of content in Hindi. So again, the issue of localization of language. There was a research project on the impact of digital exclusion, and that was reported first in the country that we supported. Another group decided to buy devices for elderly LGBTI people and teach them how to use them. Another one created educational videos about LGBTI topics and translated into sign language or Quechua. This was a group from Peru. So it was really, really broad what we were able to support. But it really felt like a drop in the ocean, to be honest. And it goes back again to the issue of funding, the issue of groups sometimes needing the even most basic tools to protect their security and not knowing where to turn to. And especially again this year with the limitation in funding, the freezing of the aid, corporation cutting on the EI projects, it's really setting the whole movement at the global level back. It's not just organizations that operate at a global level like us, but it's really having an impact even on digital issues, but more broadly, pretty much on everything. But we were able to at least put that little drop in the ocean with a hope to do it again sometime soon.
Definitely. Thanks a lot, Daniele, for sharing that. I know that Rasha and Shreshtha have to leave busy times. So I'd like to seize these probably last minutes to just say thanks a lot for your contributions, for your insights, for everything you've shared today, for the work that you do. And to the audience, don't hesitate to follow the work of our panelists and the organizations that they work in. And yeah, so you can leave. I know that you have to go. I don't know if you want a last word or something. Otherwise, thanks a lot um, for your contributions.
Just thank you all. I have to drop off, but thank you all so much, and thank you for the organizers, and the funders that made this happen. It's really been such a pleasure to be here and meet you as well. Bye.
Bye, Rasha.
Yeah, same from my side as well. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's been such a cross-learning experience from everybody here as well. Thank you for putting all the thought and care that you did in organizing this panel and the questions. And yeah, look forward to staying connected with the attendees. Chilling effect also means I'm no longer on social media because I received a lot of death threats for my activism against militarization. But yeah, I'm sure you can find Amnesty's work on TFGVV through the Make It Safe online campaign.
Thanks a lot, Shreshtha. See you soon, I hope.
See you.
Bye-bye. So yeah, just as a conclusion, there are a lot of different topics that I would have liked to talk about. I don't know, Daniele, if you want to add something.
I can only share like a big thank you, especially to you, Hazbi, for moderating the panel so beautifully and for preparing everything in the most complete way I've ever found, to be honest. To the city of Geneva for inviting us and for organizing the event together with ILGA World. I mean, it's a topic that one can just continue digging and finding more information and finding more angles on how to address it. So I just hope we were able to uh, interest our audience today in these topics and in the content of our research. And please keep engaging with us on this. Please keep us informed of how we can support you and and how organizations like us can actually help you overcome the hurdles towards digital inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Daniele. And probably Guillaume, if you want to say last word, I just want to add that I'm sending everything to M. I'll do it again to the whole audience, sharing the files with you of all the reports and also of the awareness tips that Human Rights Watch has put up on how we can protect ourselves against all of this digital violence, these digital dangers that we've seen, and I'll just share that in the chat. Otherwise, everybody, you can find them online, and don't hesitate to contact any of the panelists. I think we have the information. Otherwise, drop me an email there aren't two people in the world that are called Hazbi Avdiji, so you'll land on my profile for sure. So drop me a message, and yes, thanks a lot. I'm really looking forward to seeing where what the future holds. I think better, I hope better days somehow.